Welcome to Season 1, Episode 2 of the Living for Today podcast, where we will explore the boundaries between reality and spirituality. I'll be your host, Ryan Kurczak. In today's episode, I will be talking with Jim Norton, a retired Methodist minister, social advocate, and skilled counselor, about the dynamics of trauma and how its resolution affects our capacity to meditate and live effectively. Okay, so today I would like to take some time to talk about the idea of trauma and how trauma influences people's lives, but particularly around those times when people are having more space in their life, like when they start practicing meditation or if they take time away from their life and their work. Because one thing I had noticed whenever a friend of mine would take people on retreat in Costa Rica, there was always this issue where they thought that they were going on retreat in this beautiful place to learn meditation, and then about Tuesday or Wednesday, maybe about a third of them would have a meltdown. And we watched that multiple times, and we thought it was just a fluke. But then we started to realize that it seemed to be that the more space people had in their life and they weren't constantly running or distracting themselves with whatever it might be, then the stuff they hadn't dealt with came up. You know, some form of trauma or some form of... it can be all sorts of things, really.
Right.
So I'm here with Jim Norton today.
Hello.
Who's a retired Methodist minister. Who has an interest in mind-body experience and, I guess, psychological healing in that way. Does that seem accurate?
Sounds good.
Yeah. So just to give our listeners a little bit of background, do you mind describing what your career was like in a way, and what led you to the point where you're now interested in meditation and interested in this mind-body connection with trauma and so on?
Okay. That probably requires going back prior to the vocational choice. I am the product of an abusive family and community, having grown up in a government housing project, and my parents were deaf, so we were different, even in the project, and therefore the subject of a lot of ridicule. So there was trauma both inside, between me and my parents, centering around my gravitation to the hearing world and their attempt to get me to be their negotiator between the hearing world and the silent world. A lot of conflict there with grocery store personnel, bill collectors, that kind of thing. Well, maybe that's enough about the very beginning. In a way, the United Methodist Church was my second parent. When I was 6 months old, an elderly gentleman by the name of Mr. Kaler saw to it that my parents had me baptized. So on Palm Sunday of 1942, I was baptized. And then he saw to it that my parents made sure I took advantage of Sunday school and those kinds of things. And this was a very wealthy congregation. The inside walls are Italian marble. So here's this kid from the project going to church at a place where only the influential go. And that carried with it some stigma as well. So it seemed that everywhere I went, there was always pointed out to me the difference. And somehow or other, I just didn't measure up.
Right.
But the church sent me to camp when I was 12 years old which is a critical time psychologically. Body chemistry is going crazy and, and hormones and all of that stuff. And one day at camp, the counselors had us to find a place in the woods just by ourselves. And so I sat down against a tree and had the sense of Jesus coming in a loving and tender way. And from that time on, it was very natural for me to stay within the structure of the church. There were other conflicts through the years, especially the teenage years. I have some background in Pentecostal tradition, and that was confusing, to say the least. But finally ended up on a vocational path that took me into the United Methodist Ministry, seminary, and from there on, the path seemed pretty well set.
Right.
Then through the years, one of the things that was easy to imagine prior to that vocational choice, and the reason for the choice, was that the church was a loving place, and that my codependency and need for acceptance would be met.
Right.
I learned with my very first congregation after seminary, well, actually I learned it during student pastor days. That ain't necessarily so.
So the codependency wasn't met? Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay.
My wife and I married. I was a sophomore in college and she was a freshman. And so we went to Duke together during the time of civil rights confusion. And out of that, I think I developed a very strong social justice stance, which I have maintained through the years, and still do. But when the confusion would develop within congregations, unaware of what was happening, it would hook all of the past trauma, and that's the nature of the emotional brain. All of that stuff sticks. And so running into conflict in the church really hooked all of the other garbage from the painful past and became very debilitating at times.
So the stuff that you had dealt with previously that hadn't been processed,
right?
Whenever you'd have an issue with the church or in the church, it would kind of bring all that up.
Exactly.
And maybe you would respond
Well,
inappropriately.
it wouldn't bring it up consciously.
Right.
But the emotional brain, all it knows how to do is to emote. And if something triggers that garbage, it makes the something seem like world-shattering because of all of the other stuff that's there.
Right.
This is the end of the world. This is, and it was hard not to react to that. Fortunately, Polly, my wife, has been a stabilizing influence through all of that.
Right.
And in some ways, I feel sorry for her. But she's been the stable person. And I've been through different therapeutic modalities and did my major work at Duke in pastoral psychology, followed that up with some addictive training as well as family systems training.
Right.
So through my own therapy and having focused primarily on psychological issues, I can understand what's going on, and that is some help, but the reactivity can happen unaware. And the most recent example of that was when Kavanaugh was elevated to the Supreme Court, I went ballistic. There is no way that he is not guilty of what he was accused of. It was a very credible person who told the truth, and it hooked that stuff in my brain, and words came out of my mouth that would embarrass a sailor.
Right.
I really had a meltdown, and since then I was involved in some mind-body training through the Center for Mind-Body Medicine out of Washington, D.C. And I've been struggling with that, but it's better. Another part of the resolution has been my involvement in a meditation group, and some of the readings we have been doing in common, especially Ken Wilber's No Boundary. His observations about the only thing we have is the now,
Right.
and that everything exists in the now. When we allow the past to get in the way of that, we lose the sense of fulfillment that can come in the now. When we allow future expectations, one thing I think that is common to people who graduate from seminary in the United Methodist tradition is that they are sure the world is waiting with bated breath for all that wisdom that they've acquired, and someday they may even become bishop. You know? and if you focus too much on that kind of future possibility, once again you're doomed.
Right. Yeah.
for conflict, because the present never seems to
Right.
Entertain such possibilities.
Yeah.
Yesterday I was at Walmart. I'm sorry. I do shop at Walmart because of the prices.
And we're in West Virginia, so the nearest Whole Food store is 2 hours away. So we do our best, and they do have some organic foods now and whatnot.
Right.
So.
But there was a little boy in the cart. You know how parents put their children in one side of the cart, and I wasn't paying any attention. I was in line behind him, getting ready to check out, and he made some loud noise. I was looking at the magazines in the racks and at the checkout counter, and it startled me, and I looked at him. And I waved, and he waved, and we carried on this. He was 16 months old, I found out, but he already had developed an interesting vocabulary, and we just had the best time playing with one another, peekaboo, and while his dad was checking out the groceries. So,
Right.
and it's moments like that make everything okay. That make everything okay.
Right. And you can't really appreciate moments like that if you would have been all hooked into your past emotional pain. You would have overlooked it. Would have
That's
just
right.
passed by.
Oh, who's that screaming kid?
Right. Right.
Get away from me, kid.
So I guess the best way to check out where you are with your emotional pain is just take a trip to Walmart. Let's see how it goes.
Well, sometimes the sights are a little
Yeah.
bizarre.
Yeah. But anyway.
And I'm saying nothing more about that.
That's good. Because this is one of our pilot shows, so we'll see how it goes. So when you've been doing work with individuals, and you've been seeing, for example, you worked with Melissa and I when we did our premarital counseling.
Correct.
20 years ago. It was a while ago. And when you see that, you have a different kind of vantage point, So when you saw me responding to something, you saw Melissa responding to something, I obviously thought that I knew that I was responding in a way that made a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. When really, if there were conflicts in the relationship at that age, when you're just 19, 20 or so on, usually your responses are coming from, or my responses I would think were coming from just past triggers, things that were not conscious.
Correct.
And in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, there is a description of what the root cause of pain is. And it says the root cause of pain is the absence of self-awareness. The absence of self-awareness. And that I've contemplated that and I thought about it, and when people start getting involved in meditation or they start trying to improve their lives, oftentimes it is painful in the beginning because they have to develop that self-awareness. And then they become aware of all of those triggers. They become aware of all of those traumas. And some people can push it down and still try to move forward, or they try to deal with it, but it's hard because there's a lot of input that has not been dealt with.
That's right.
So in your experience, when you, say, have worked with individuals and you can see their triggers, but they can't.
Right.
What are some useful ways that you use to help encourage them to take a look at those things, to kind of maybe pull them a little bit out of the emotional brain such that they can develop greater self-awareness?
Right.
Any kind of tips or tricks there?
Yeah. It's been different with different people. My base therapeutic method is one developed by Carl Rogers, Rogerian, client-centered therapy, and its insistence, one of its tenets, is that you follow the client, you don't rush ahead of the client. And it takes very careful listening to begin to pick up the cues, and then you follow those. Some clients have absolutely refused to consider the possibility of hidden motivators, and that is a very long journey if they stick with the process. Other clients have been more open, but it's still a slow process. It's like the thin layers of an onion. You can only peel them off very slowly and very carefully. It's a long process, which makes it inefficient from the DSM-5 point of view, and from most of the mental health facilitators, whatever.
And those who don't know what the DSM-5 is, that's the handbook for disorders.
In order to get insurance payment for services rendered, you have to be able to find a code in the DSM-5 of mental health disorders, in order to justify it. Right.
But anyway, so you were saying that it's a gentle process that you have to go through.
Right. And it's inefficient. I have since learned that there are techniques in body-mind medicine that can create some valuable shortcuts, and may be especially beneficial to persons who are resistant to the more Freudian approaches. Family systems as well, looking at the dynamics of family life and pointing out how certain tendencies seem to reoccur in each generation, can be helpful. So people then at least have some tools by which they can decide, okay, do I want this to go on or not?
In a general way, would that be, for example, one's father maybe has, again, generally speaking, anger issues?
Oh, yes.
And so therefore a child may respond in the same way. Maybe not necessarily because that child experienced the same kind of trauma or abuse that triggered it in the parent,
Right.
but somehow it's passed on.
Right.
Right. So then
Right.
it's almost as if we're all not just processing our own stuff, but also familial things as well.
Right. Yeah, there's a family systems approach is strictly biological. It does not willy-nilly accept Freudian psychological understanding. It looks at things very scientifically, and it's from the family systems people, as well as anthropologists and others who look at human behavior, that we're discovering that some of these tendencies, emotional tendencies, may be transmitted through our DNA,
Right.
so that they get embedded in the DNA and become kind of an expectation that this is the way we're supposed to behave.
Right.
But logically, where do parents learn how to parent? Usually from their parents,
Right.
and so that's just a reasonable understanding of how it gets transmitted from one generation to another.
But it's also, I mean, it's that, but I also remember you talking to me about when big events occurred.
Yes.
Like, for example, something, if you lose a spouse, and that occurred in the spring. And then as the years go by, if depression comes around in the spring, it could be that it's from, well, how do you approach that? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Well, and there again, family systems is helpful because one of its techniques is to do a genogram. So you look at major events like that, they become nodal events, and you can pretty well predict that every year at a certain time, the emotional brain is going to emote the sense of loss and grief, and the individual may not remember or may not even think about, just wondering, why in the hell do I feel so badly?
Right. And that can make a person feel crazy.
Yes.
That makes it worse because then they don't know why, and they just have this, and people say you shouldn't feel that way.
Right.
And then it makes it worse.
That's right. That compounds it.
Yeah. And so that was something that I think that you did again with Melissa and I when we did the premarital counseling, because we looked at specific events in our past, but also in our family's past.
Right.
That way, when something came up around that time, we wouldn't necessarily blame each other for it.
Right. Oh, it's never that simple.
Right.
Many couples, not you and Melissa, but many couples tend to think that they're angry and upset with one another because of something that just happened. Right. It is never that.
Well, an interesting experience occurred. I might have shared it with you. It was when it might have been after Melissa had her bone marrow transplant, and we had that sort of few-month window of things being really good. And then one day, I was sitting on the couch meditating, and it occurred to me that many of the ways that I treated Melissa that were difficult or, I don't know, more of a pain in the ass to her than anything else, it occurred to me the reason I did that was because of an underlying sense of dread about something that I had no idea what it was about.
Yeah.
And then something would occur within our life, and I would say, well, it must be that. So I would attribute this underlying sense of dread to something that happened right now.
Exactly.
And really, it had nothing to do with it.
Exactly.
And that was a mind-blowing experience. And I told Melissa, and she looked at me and she said, "You finally figured that out?"
Did she whop you along the side of the head?
No, but she was profoundly grateful.
I'm sure.
But that's the kind of thing that I think many people don't understand, because even at that point in time, personally, I had been meditating and practicing yoga and doing all these things for at least 18, somewhere between 15 and 18 years during that time period. And many people think that if you go through a lot of these spiritual types of processes, that takes care of everything. And it doesn't.
Mm-mm.
And, I've had conversations with people when they ask me about, I have this issue, how should I deal with it?
Mm-hmm.
And I recommend talking to a counselor.
Right.
And I tell them it could take months to figure that out.
Mm-hmm.
But if you want to do the hard work, that's what's going to figure it out for you.
Right.
Maybe you'll get lucky and you'll meditate enough, and 18 years later you'll have that aha moment.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can get someone to help you do that. But on the other hand, I also encourage them not to become addicted to therapy.
Right.
Because then I'd like to talk to you about that.
The
But
codependency.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
but back to the point. So for individuals who have an interest in self-realization, self-actualization, and for those of them who are practicing meditation and doing what they know how to do and what they've been taught to do,
Mm-hmm.
what is a realistic approach to the other part of their life which could relate to those unresolved triggers or unresolved traumas? What is a realistic way to approach that, to look at that, such that they can continue with their practice while also attending to these other past issues?
Right. Well, your suggestion to see a counselor, I think, is an excellent suggestion. The emotional brain, the hypothalamus and all of the nerve centers that are back there, all it knows how to do is emote. Mm-hmm. And the negative stuff we experience in life sticks back there, and it doesn't forget it. Mm-hmm. And so it's always ready at the least little inkling or trigger to emote. And one of the problems in the country today has precisely to do with this problem. We call it impulse control. If I feel a certain way, then I'm justified to do whatever I want in reaction to that. So if I hate somebody, that means I'm justified to pick up a gun and shoot him or her. Right. And one of the helpful things about the counseling process is to begin to realize that the difference between the function of the emotional brain, which is constantly emoting, and if it's been through very traumatic stuff that has stuck, is to become aware of all of the factors that are stored up in there, and then begin to use the cognitive parts of the brain to take a look at that, and at the same time to think of the emotional brain as that little child that keeps wanting to throw a tantrum. Mm-hmm. Well, what do you do with a child when it's throwing a tantrum? Mm-hmm. Different situations merit different techniques, but one of the things you do is you love and embrace that child, and you get the cognitive brain to assure that child you're safe now. We will not let you go out of control, mm-hmm. because it's not good for either of us, right. If you want to talk about it that way. So recognizing what the emotional brain is doing, and what the most likely reasons are that it's doing that, and even feeling some measure of self-pity toward a child that's been abused,
right.
And loving that child. Not always an easy thing to do,
right.
But in terms of my experience in working with individuals and privilege of working with them, that kind of approach over time seems to help. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But it is time consuming, and our modern world doesn't make much room for time, right. To do that kind of work.
And when you were talking about the cognitive portions of the brain, were you talking more about like the frontal,
right?
The frontal lobes
and the rational portions of the brain.
Right. So
you get the two of them. They don't normally talk to each other.
Right.
But you impulse control means using your reasoning ability to say, it may not be a good idea to pick up that gun.
Right. It doesn't mean that you don't have the impulse.
Right.
It means that your
exactly.
brain kicks in and
Right.
says, and that's one thing I think it's important to keep in mind. In meditation, there's a lot of focus on holding your awareness in the frontal part of the brain.
Right.
And by doing that, that develops, impulse control, positive outlook, forward thinking.
Right.
But that's the interesting thing I think a lot of meditators come up against is that, like, again, for example, from my experience, I've spent a lot of time meditating on the frontal part of the brain, which means that when something comes up or a trauma arises, that self-awareness allows me to see it.
Yes.
And so that gives the opportunity to decide, okay, do I let this express or do I not because it's going to hurt someone or something? But it still doesn't change the fact that those triggers are back there.
Oh, not at all.
You see, like, I think that's what, I think people have this idea that by meditating in a certain way that all those triggers will go away. But what happens is meditation gives the ability for self-awareness to arise such that you can recognize the actual work that needs to be done to work through those triggers.
Exactly.
To say, hey, maybe I do need to think long-term and talk to a counselor or someone who does mind-body psychological approach or, my favorite, eye movement desensitization reprocess and EMDR.
Yeah.
But you can't quite, most people have a hard time getting there because they don't have maybe that development of the frontal regions of the brain to where they can think forward enough to see how that would be helpful.